Ladies and gentlemen, we continue with our video blog about how to make the planning more efficient and effective. Today is the session where we actually deep dive with Lovely and Deepak on how to do the supply planning, cost planning, and gross profit planning across SAP IBP and SAP Analytics Cloud. So that's the scope of today's session. We will do the bit of the introduction on the process level, and then we showcase to you how the things could be done in real life or in the project or in the design session with the use of the model like we developed with our team. So most probably you're familiar with that high-level architecture where we talk about really the need to connect SAP IBP and as well the SAP Analytics Cloud with the operational system for the purpose of running the planning process. So maybe since we are on that topic, maybe it would be good, Deepak, that you actually highlight the key learnings from the integration. And maybe I just bring up this question to you for the integration of, in the supply planning, we had the various streams of the supply, meaning material requirement planning, but as well machine or the labor requirements. Maybe you can tell us a little bit on what was this really about to integrate those two tools for the machine or a labor requirements integration between the SAP IBP and SAC.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Yeah, so for integrating machine time data that is needed for the cost calculation, what we have done, we have investigated how data will be is being stored in SAP IBP for this supply element, and then what we have done, we have built some queries in SAC side, and we have scheduled those queries for timely refresh. Okay, so after scheduling the queries, data will be refreshed automatically in the dashboards and visualization that we have created. And we have done some special configuration to manage different level between SAP and SAP IBP and SAP Analytics Cloud. Like we have done some aggregation, exception aggregation. We have enabled for this special configuration. And apart from this, to enable this SAP IBP machine requirement calculation that is for the plant cost rate changes, apart from this, to run cost calculation of planner cost rate, we have also integrated with S/4HANA for the standard cost rates. So
Right.
This is what we have done briefly that I'm explaining here.
Right. So what we envisage in the model is the integration of the standard cost rate, like you were saying, right, for the machine, labor, and the others, because with the planning data, which came from the SAP IBP and then was complemented for this specific machine requirement planning and the cost planning related to the machine, we did use the SAP IBP and SAC, right? So then we actually combined that together. And this difference in the levels is very important to recognize because not every single cost element or a cost would be planned the same granularity like in SAP IBP, right? That's our learning, I would say.
Yes. Yeah, correct.
Okay, good. So, I mean, since we are still on that one, because there is a little sign there here, like a bidirectional, maybe can you share one maybe example of how the data would be like a populated back between SAP IBP and, SAC, SAP Analytics Cloud and SAP IBP? Maybe one example would be good.
Yeah. So yes, SAP has provided standard connection between SAP IBP and SAP Analytics Cloud for retraction, that is sending back data to SAP IBP, that is source system in this case. So in this scenario, we have aligned our integration back that is possible to be done for baseline scenario. So therefore, once alternate scenario is selected, we copy data to baseline scenario, And then we have created some flows that will send SAP Analytics Cloud data to SAP IBP for specific data elements.
All right, right. I mean, because that's a very good point. So thank you for bringing this up, because it's really what decision making means as well, that this becomes a valid version of the plan. So then it becomes a baseline, right? So not anymore like alternative, right? So thank you for that. So we are today discussing a supply review, and the supply review, it is about really planning a feasible supply plan. In a moment, I share some more details onto it, but as well planning your costs. Today as well, we will cover an integrated reconciliation where we actually balance supply and demand, balance revenue with the cost to generate a gross profit plan. And that's what we will cover today in more depth, showcasing this as well in the systems. So one of the key elements of the whole solution is a proper assignment. So how to really set up the right element in the process with the right data flow, and as well with the right master system. So this is just a list of the key things which we considered in our model, what you see here, and this is for the supply review as we discussed earlier. So as part of it, we will use the information from the strategic planning process, like a budgeting, to really to compare our plans versus the budgeted cost element and budgeted COGS. As well, what we will do here is actually perform the certain supply planning elements directly in SAP, because this tool is SAP IBP is really designed to do the supply chain planning. So here we're talking about the planning of your own capacity, external capacity, planning your labor or machine requirements with the heuristic or supply optimizer. We're planning here a material requirements, inventories, safety stock or strategic stocks. We're planning as well a transportation requirements and many others, right? So because the tool is much more broader, it's just that we still captured in the model those elements to make it more real, and we build this based on the use cases coming from our customers and workshops. So with them. So now next step is really in the activity of planning a cost, right? So variable cost and the fixed cost. With the variable, we really use the information from SAP IBP and as well as for and the other ERP systems if needed, because we combine the information about the plant requirements for the specific element of the cost, like labor, machine requirements coming from SAP IBP, material requirements, and maybe some safety stock transportation requirements. And then we actually planning a future cost rates. But in order to plan future cost rate, you should know as well a performance of the actuals and the standard cost rate for the specific machine, for the specific labor element or a transportation lane, right? And that's what we actually built in the model, really combine those things in order to plan a future cost with the use of the planned future cost rates. And finally, we're actually talking about really integrating additional master data, additional actuals for produce items, they produce cost, and so on. So in order to really to plan a full picture, and as we discussed in the previous video, in our planning model, we combine actuals, so what happened in the past, plus the plan on a scenario level to have a full visibility of the performance versus our strategic plan captured in the budget for the current year and as well for the next. In our simplified process model, which you see here, we actually using an information from 3 systems, as we said, from S4 or your ERP system for the standard cost rates and the actuals. Standard cost rates for the standard labor, machine, transportation, subcontracting, materials, right? those elements which are typically in your costing model. Then we actually as well integrated, of course, bill of materials routing from the execution system. Then we actually use the information which was done in the previous, completed in the previous step. So product consensus demand plan. And with the use of the bill of material and routing, with the SAP IBP engine of heuristics and the supply optimization engine, we did actually calculate material requirements, labor requirements, machine transportation, inventory plan, and even requirements for the external manufacturing, right? So this is really the heart and the biggest value of SAP IBP, really to plan this and optimize the supply chain planning. So then once we had that, we combined this with the third layer of SAC, as you see, and then we actually planned already our future cost based on those requirements and based on the planned changes in the cost rates for the specific data stream. So it could be for labor, for machine, subcontracting, transportation. And finally, we came up with the plan which covers all types of a cost, which can be as well as the upper part shows compared to the budgeted costs. In order to complement this type of a planning with the more explanation, let's deep dive into a little bit more details how it was done. So we actually shared with you that we sort of defined in SAP IBP, as it is shown on the bottom, systems in which the activities is being shown for the upper part are shown on the bottom. We actually define our material requirement plan and labor and so on with the use of SAP IBP. Those data streams have its own types of drivers. And so basically we don't talk really about only the drivers for the demand planning and the revenue planning, but conceptually you can understand certain elements in the supply chain as a driver for the specific capacity, material or transportation requirements. Let's give you just a few examples. Labor requirements plan could be depending on the number of the working days which you have in the specific plant. Maintenance day, which are actually scheduled for the specific machine, because it actually deducts availability of the resources. Next element could be that for the work centers where operators are actually are influencing the output, maybe number of the operators is as well a variable or a driver for increasing or decreasing your output. And finally, based on the information which comes from the past, you can assess the specific work center efficiency with the use of the data from the actuals S4 and as well as SAP IBP. So then at the end, you can use those drivers, as I just said, as an example in the labor requirements and the labor planning, really to manipulate, to plan really the best out of it. So meaning really to plan the better output. Finally, we take this information and we proceed further for the calculation of the costing. So then we take really the standard cost rates for the specific data flow, so labor, machine, and so on. And we actually take this into the planning, meaning we use utilize the information from SAP IBP for it. So example is that we use the utilization for the specific work center coming from the labor requirements. And if it's overutilized, meaning above the 100 or maybe even 95% or higher, then you would need to increase maybe your cost rate because for the specific element like a labor, because maybe you would need to hire a temporary worker, maybe availability of your contractual employees, right, are not there during the summer or at Christmas. So then you actually compensate with the temporary workers, but with the higher cost. So integrating this information into the SAC will help you to plan your specific cost element and overall cost. Then further on to the right-hand side, we as well for supply planning, we planning additional supply chain provisions. So it could be, for example, that you have in your portfolio the products which have a limited shelf life, and then you have to plan some write-off. So you really, maybe you have to really destroy portion of your inventories, but in the future, and if it's happening like that, based on the past experience, it may be useful to plan a provision which will actually be then revised when the plan will materialize and operationalize. So going further to the right, last element is really comparison to your budgeted costs. And maybe one thing, so this is just an example of the flow for the material requirements and the labor, but then you can really break this down in more depth. For the sake of simplification, we just brought here those two elements. So what you see here is really the SAP IBP engine, right? And user interface is in Excel, but as well in the web UI. But here we see really the main planning screen for the supply planners. And of course, the configuration could be really various, but let me highlight on the key elements and make a connection to what was presented earlier. So we do one of the supply elements, and its planning is really capacity planning. It could be done for the internal resources, but as well for the external. For the internal resources, as we discussed, you have for this particular, it's more related to the labor requirements. We actually have here a possibility to play with the drivers. So in this case, either the playing with the specific maintenance days, working days across the periods, right? But if those are fixed, actually, maybe it's more about introducing in the alternative scenario additional shift like it is actually proposed here, just to manage that overutilization of this specific work center. Manipulating those drivers will help you to optimize the output based on the information you possess, not just the configuration which is standardized, right? Because it's really about finding the best and realistic solution for your supply planning. Similar exercise for the supply planning could be done for the external resources, but maybe with less details like it is in the own manufacturing for the machine and for the labor planning, right? So then, but still it can be in certain extent optimized because of the drivers you can align on with your suppliers. Another element of the supply planning, which is done in SAP IBP, is material requirement planning. So your consensus demand plan and the sign-off of the demand review should be actually a trigger to populate this information for planning your supply, right? But one of the elements is really to use the bill of material and really populate this demand with the use of the work in progress, transits, stock on hand, block stock, and the other elements in the supply chain master data to really plan your material requirements planning. And this is what is done in SAP IBP as well. But most probably you would not like to maybe do the material planning for every single component, meaning some of them are really like more like a consumables, pallets, stretch folly, which might be not really relevant. So one of the key advice is actually just bring to SAP the most critical elements of your bill of material and not everything. And for this stream, this data stream will be as well useful for planning your costs. Additionally, you actually as well would like to see your inventory position, maybe plan your strategic inventories, but as well, generally to plan your inventory, you could use the SAP IBP because this is really what is designed for. Additionally, as part of the supply planning process, what you do is actually planning your safety stock. So in SAP IBP, there is a special, very sophisticated engine for multi-echelon inventory optimization. And this engine considers a supply variability, like a variability of the lead time. So how regular your production is. So meaning from the start to the end date of the specific batch, or the supply supply receipts if they are according to the to the plant master data or not. Then demand variability is another set of the driver for calculation of the safety stock. It could be the variability of your forecasting error. And as well, you give as one of the input is a service variability. So at the end, your target of the expected service level maybe per segment of the product, as we discussed in the product review. So using a product segmentation to set up accordingly a service level is actually the best practice when using multi-echelon inventory optimization. And finally, I would say we finish with the last cost element, because I took the perspective of the costing and actually making a connection to the supply chain. Here we talk about really connecting the transportation requirements for the mid to long term plan. And we see that we have a ship to location and ship from location. So at the end, we can, with the use of the SAP IBP, define for the transportation lanes with the special codification you could actually build there, which will be meaningful from the costing perspective to amend the specific transportation requirements from the costing perspective, right? So really planning your cost rates in the future with use of this data. So ladies and gentlemen, here we see that in our model, we have a supply and capacity element. What it means is that we pull the information on a data stream level, which we need to have in SAC for planning the costs. So capacities are being pulled from SAP IBP, so capacity utilization for the labor, for the machine, for the transportation, supply planning as well. Like, for example, some of the requirements for the requirements for the capacity are actually shown here. So at the end, we can still analyze certain drivers directly in the SAC based on the information provided in SAP IBP and complemented with S4, apologies. So we pulled as well information about, as we said, capacities, but as well for the inventories. So we wanted to as well analyze our coverage of the inventory versus past sales or a future forecast, and that's what is actually shown here. So we actually have a segmentation of the product. We have as well the inventory positions, right? And we have average sales and the average consensus demand plan to calculate the stock coverage. So that as well could be monetized and complemented with the additional information in order to make a decision about the impact from the inventory side to the balance sheet and the cost. Further on, we still, to get more insights about planning your cost, we populated the inventory projection and as well a plan for your safety stock. So all of those elements together were on purpose and deliberately integrated to get more insights to finalize a planning in SAC, a planning of our costs. What you see on the screen is actually the cost planning value driver tree. So this is the value driver tree, which we consider to be useful to plan your variable part of the cost, but as well planning your key drivers for it. And now, how did we brought this into the model? First of all, we discussed with our colleagues in finance and the customers how to structure the costing. And the total cost we did structure according to the very sort of a common type of a split of type of the cost. So we are planning a labor cost, machine cost, material overhead cost, and the transportation cost. Then those costs, as we discussed earlier, can be only planned and calculated here in SAC with the use of the standard cost rate coming from S4 or ERP. And the most important element is really from the data with SAP IBP about planned requirements for those data streams. So one of the key things here is that you planning your cost changes on maybe for a specific cost element on aggregated level or on more detailed level. with the use of the expert input or with the use of the predictive functions. And what we have here modeled is the following, is that, for example, in some of the business model, you don't need to maybe plan in a sophisticated way or with the predictive function your planned cost rates for the transportation as an example. So what it means is that it's good enough if you're planning the change really on aggregated level. And that's what I just did. Actually, I plan an increase of the cost rate because maybe through the filters, it's good enough that I'm planning for the specific country or a group of the countries. And then this information was populated through the cost plan of the cost rate change for the transport, then its value, and then it was impacting as well right away my total cost of goods sold for this selection criteria. Those are the ratio which help you to understand how far your plan and the change is versus the budget.
Or a what if simulation at a high level, which is at a year level. So in case we want to do at a more granular level, we have these top tabs here, which would direct us to detailed stories for the fixed cost and variable cost planning. So suppose we get into the variable cost planning story. Here we have various dimension filters, which can be selected as per the user expertise. We have the table here, which is at a monthly level and can also be drilled down to a date level. So let's go to the predictive forecast feature here. So as we select the predictive forecast feature, we have this pop-up box here. So first we need to define the version in which we are planning. So let's select the alternative scenario. Then we have to define the granularity in which we want to forecast. So say, suppose we want to forecast at monthly level and for 2 of the future months, so Feb and March. We can also choose the algorithm for the forecast. It could be an automatic forecast, which would be a best fit model automatically taken up by the backend ML algorithm of SAC. And otherwise, we have a linear regression or triple exponential smoothing option. So suppose we take this one and we choose to consider the historic data starting from January 2020. Now we can click on preview to see how the numbers would generate. Okay, so now the preview is generated and we have the 2 months forecast for the future. And we can also zoom in a bit. Now these dotted lines are the forecasted one and these full lines are what we have from the earlier numbers of historic data. The orange shaded area would show the confidence interval limit, which would be how accurate the forecast would be, and it may vary between these bounds.
As well, what would make sense for the specific use case is actually to use the information which comes from SAP IBP. On purpose, we populated information about labor utilization here, which you see here on the line before. And this labor utilization could be used as a factor to plan your labor cost rate change, because those are historical and the future values for the labor utilization, right? So this could be as well used by the expert to plan your cost rate change. Once you apply a cost rate change, it will take the volumes for the associated, I would say, data stream and use this planned cost rate to calculate the values, because that's how it works for the variable part. The similar logic is for the, as you have in the bottom, if you scroll down, you have as well for the machines, right? You have as well a machine utilization, and then on the bottom of this table below, we have as well machine utilization percentages and as well machine cost rate changes. So you can actually leverage this type of a concept when doing planning of these two elements. On the further on in our costing model, if you switch to the transportation from the list of value, we can take into account the transportation requirement coming from the distribution requirement planning from SAP IBP, populated here and multiply with the certain changes for the specific cost rate, but as well on the desired level, because you may apply a cost rate changes for more specific that in the value driver tree, and that's really the purpose of the planning with the stories. Let's go ahead with fixed cost planning and use case.
Okay, sure. So now here we have a fixed cost planning sheet. where again we can do a detailed and granular level of planning. So suppose we have the fixed cost line here. What we can do is allocate this number based on the ratio that we have here for the material plant consumption. So for this, we have a data action calculation written. What it would do is if we put any number in this line, it would allocate based on the profit centers ratio. So let's do that.
Maybe just a build on what you are saying. Material consumption here in this screen was populated from SAP IBP. We just aggregated the values to the specific consumption and the profit center. So because that's the allocation key which was discussed with the controllers. But still, please continue.
Right. So let's just change this number and put it to 20. Okay, so by default, now this number has split to the month level. We'll just run this calculation now and see how it allocates.
So I assume now the calculation has finished. Oh, thank you. Good. Can you explain now what we see?
Yes. So now the numbers are split into the profit centers here in these two lines, which is based on the ratio here, which is coming from IBP. So this is quite an effective way for the users to do an allocation at one go based on any other factor or a driver.
Excellent, because this is really what some of our customers was looking for, really how to plan a cost allocation to make a really planned planning with this cost element as well in more detail. So, and then for this you can develop a predefined type of an allocation or an ad hoc. We use the predefined one with this action button. We now continue with the explanation of the model for the process step called integrated reconciliation. Just as a reminder, we use a well-established process framework called integrated business planning, but we really expanded this with combining it with the financial planning in order to have a full financial impact in the decision making. So in this case, we actually leverage as well information from at least 3 types of the system. So one is actually SAP IBP, when it does really try to balance a supply demand, but more from the volumetric side. As well, we actually now combine the information being captured in SAC about the revenues, cost of sales, planned cost, which we just showcased before. In this video or in the previous one, we finalizing a planning of your future sales price and future cost rate. And the last not least element of the information which we will use is actually the S4 or the other system, because some of the drivers might require to be populated with the data from other than S4 system. So in this slide, what we try to illustrate is actually what type of a systems and as well what are activities which we should consider when building the gross profit plan optimized, right? So one type of the information which is already stored in SAC is your planned revenues, because we actually develop this net revenue plan based on the information from SAP IBP, and as well for the related to the consensus demand plan. We use SAP IBP data for the monetization of the cost plan, and actually this is visualized here on the left hand side. So we have net revenues and the cost already in the system. We might need to do the balancing, or maybe as well trying to optimize the gross profit if it's still maybe not on the right level, and the final decision of this and the other processes should be back integrated, as we discussed with Deepak, to the source system, right? So this we will cover in more depth in the next video, but the concept is, I hope, pretty clear, that we have the net revenues, we have a cost plan here together with the inside data for on the volumetric side, and we actually running here a gross profit planning. So what we will do here is actually plan your gross profit, but here, for that purpose, we built the gross profit value driver tree. So we did select the key elements of the net revenue, what we would like to maybe consider in replanning, because typically they are the most important ones for us. It could be like that one of the key elements of the change, very often change, or which we can actually sort of an influence, is the level of the specific net revenue stream. So in this case, we actually planning a change in the returns ratio, because in some businesses it's allowed to return the products without big financial consequences to the customer or distributors. And then it means that we actually would as well recalculate the underlying provision for it, so meaning at the end reducing net revenues as one of the example. The other example is that maybe you would like to plan some of the changes of the on a cost side as well, right? But maybe not to replan everything, right? So that's maybe a concept of the integrated reconciliation. You're replanning the key elements of your gross profit with the value driver tree, mostly on aggregated level. Gross profit planning very often is being discussed, like what's the value of the gap between this actuals and the plan compared to the budget. And it's very important to have analytical capabilities which actually support you with that type of insights. What are the missing, I would say, or leakages from the revenue perspective? So what is the revenue at risk, right? So here with this dynamic navigation, you can actually spot in which period or which aggregation level, countries, product lines, and so on, we have the biggest gap between the demand plan, which is unconstrained, and the constrained plan. So where are there still opportunities maybe to optimize certain things in order to minimize the leakage of the revenue? Because that's really as well one of the things we would like to ensure, that the leakage of the revenue is the lowest as part of the objective of integrated business planning. Ladies and gentlemen, so that's all for today with this video blog. Lovely, Deepak, thank you very much for contributing in development of the model, but as well explaining the details. So one more time, thank you, and thank you for chipping in your views and experience in it. So we actually finished now the fourth process step. We will just make one more video with the planning of the profit and loss statement, and this will close really the full cycle of integrated business planning combined with financial.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Thanks, Lovely.
Thank you, everyone.